Hello, everyone. We are in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 6, looking at two occurrences of the Hebrew word key, which I'm highlighting on the left-hand side of your screen right now. And I think that these cases are some of the more interesting ones to translate because we're getting some new interpretations that finally make sense. But for some context, in case this is the first episode you're watching, we're translating all the occurrences of the Hebrew word key in the Old Testament. And we're using the theory that it can only be translated in one of two ways: the conditional if and the complementizer that. Now, I'm linking in the top right hand side of my screen a link for you to see what complementizers are in case you aren't familiar. Let's dive into this text. So, in verse 5, we have this imperative: Come, O house of Jacob, and let us walk in the light of Yahweh. So Isaiah is speaking to the house of Jacob, and he's saying, let's walk in the light of Yahweh. He wants the people to walk in God's light. And then we have what I think is the craziest translation. For you have abandoned your people, the house of Jacob, because they are filled with influences from the east. Now, this switch from Isaiah talking to Israel to Isaiah now turning to God and saying, "For you have abandoned your people," is just a crazy switch. People don't speak like this, and I think it's pretty nutty that any translator ever thought this was a good idea. Uh, Before we go into translating the word key ourselves and coming to an intelligent interpretation of this text, we should note that our English translators tend to default to whatever the Septuagint does. So even though they say they're translating the Hebrew text, that's pretty questionable, I find, a lot of the time. So the Septuagint translated this as for. Well, it's gar, but the equivalent is in English would be for. And the interpretation would be this imperative was spoken to Israel because God had abandoned his people. I mean, okay. And it just, I can understand it to some degree if it was at least, come, O Jacob, let's walk in the light of Yahweh, for he will abandon you, or he is abandoning you. And that's kind of like a warning. But to switch who you're addressing in the speech act causal just makes zero sense. Anyways, so yeah, we seem to have gone along the lines of the silly Septuagint translation. And I also have the Dead Sea Scrolls available for us to look at here. So you'll notice that the Hebrew word key is definitely in the scrolls as well, in multiple scrolls as well. You can also see down here the remnants of it. These little square brackets tell you that there was a hole in the parchment and they couldn't see what this first letter was, but the second letter is there, so we know that key would have been there, and is fully preserved in these other parchments. So it's definitely in the text. This isn't a textual error in our Masoretic manuscript. And because the Septuagint was translating it, although badly, the fact that they did translate it tells us that back when Isaiah was translated into Greek, the word key was there. So we can't avoid having to deal with this word by saying it's a textual problem. So if we're going to go with these two translation options, we have two ways of thinking about it. So let's work through them. First is the conditional. So if you have abandoned your people, the house of Jacob, that they are filled with things from the east and soothsayers like the Philistines. So what would this be here? Just that. Well, in Hebrew, they often omit the word is, and they often omit pronouns like it. So what we could have here is, if you have abandoned your people, the house of Jacob, it is that they are filled with things from the east. So this is an interpretation of the conditional clause. So if no one is making food, it's that we won't have dinner tonight. So it is that sentence interprets the consequences of the conditional clause. So in this condition, this is the interpretation of that condition. And many languages do this. In English, I don't think we speak that way very often, but in Korean, it is apparently quite normal to speak that way. So, in other languages, it's a normal way of communicating, and that makes good sense. So, if you have abandoned your people, well, what does it mean that God would have abandoned His people? Is he unfaithful? Does He break covenant? Not at all. If He has done this, there's only one possible reason or one interpretation for what's going on for why He would have done this. It's because they abandoned Him first, and they became filled with things from the east and soothsayers and all of that. So that's our conditional interpretation of this text. So a conditional followed by a complementizer. There's another interpretation that's possible. So that's starting off with that. Now in English, we do exclamatives in a few different ways, like how big your ears are. Like they're so big, but I'm expressing with how. But there's another way we can do these exclamations, and it's not just English, all the world's languages do this. You start off with the complementizer that, and then you say something that you find shocking. So, that you would speak to me this way. Or, that it would come to this. So, in this interpretation, we have Isaiah. He calls on the people to follow, go with him and walk in the light of Yahweh. And then in a separate turn of discourse, he expresses his shock, this negative shock, and he's expressing it to God. That you have abandoned your people, the house of Jacob. And then it's followed up by what in Spanish is, they call it a causal complementizer, but I don't think it's really cause so much as it is giving context to what was just said. So in Spanish, you say a sentence, you say the complementizer that or que, and then you follow it up with another sentence that gives context to the first sentence so that it makes more sense. So in this interpretation, Isaiah expresses his negative shock that God has abandoned his people, and he follows it up with the context that gives sense to that shock. So how do we make sense of Isaiah's shock about Yahweh having abandoned his people? Though it's sensible in light of the fact that they have become filled with things from the east and soothsayers, and they're like, what is this? With the children of foreigners, they are striking, maybe clapping hands, striking deals. So they're focused on magic, idolatry, and making deals with foreigners instead of Yahweh. So Isaiah is expressing his shock that God would abandon his people, and then he's making sense of, providing context for which that expression makes sense. And that context is that the people have abandoned God first. So in this interpretation, we have context for shock. So we have an imperative, come, let's walk. Now, presumably, some time has passed between verse 5 and verse 6. Now, we have to remember that Isaiah didn't sit down and write chapter 1 to 66. This book was revealed over time. We don't know how much time passes between verses, but we do know that he wrote this book over 40 plus years. So we could easily have months or years passing between when one verse ends and the next begins. So Isaiah could have made this call to Israel and then waited months and observed what was going on, and then made this shock statement to Yahweh, like that you have abandoned your people. It's shocking. And then made a contextual comment that gives sense to what Isaiah is talking about, and that is that the people abandoned Yahweh first. And just because it makes sense that God would turn his back on his people when they have first turned their back on him, doesn't mean that when you're amongst that nation that you aren't expressing shock that Yahweh has given up and isn't doing more to try to bring the people back at this point. I mean, he's for hundreds of years at this point, he had been trying to bring the people back, sending prophets, calling them to be faithful. And now it seems that Yahweh is actually abandoning his people, and Isaiah is expressing shock that it is happening. Perhaps he was personally expecting Yahweh to continue to be gracious and to continue to be patient, but that's not happening. Now, personally, between these two interpretations, the conditional followed by the uh, interpretation of the conditional, I like that one a little bit better. I think it makes a little bit more sense, but we can't negate the possibility of the second one that I was talking about, where Isaiah is expressing shock and following it up with a contextual comment that helps us understand where that shock is coming from, or not so much where the shock is coming from, but how to make sense of his shock. So the context behind the shock. And what I'll do is I'll put up in the right hand corner a link to the what I was calling the Spanish contextualizing complementizer, or the what the literature calls a causal complementizer, in the right hand corner, so you can learn more about that. We don't use it in English, so it's harder for us to conceptualize, but it's used quite frequently in Spanish. So I'll show you about it there.